So, Glaive, Peter, welcome to Oidhche and Barst. And it is Oidhche where you live. For most of us here, it's either late morning or afternoon. But could you start out perhaps by telling us a bit about your own background?
Thanks so much for having me here. It's a great honor to be able to speak to you all. And I'm glad we could get the gossip out of the way before it was being recorded. So if you're just listening to the recording, oh, what the gossip we had. I'm originally from the Isle of Lewis. I grew up on the west side of Lewis, the Atlantic coast, and we were always told that the next stop was Canada, looking west from where I grew up. So there was always this sense of proximity at a distance. Like many people from Lewis, had cousins, second or third cousins in Canada and the United States and Australia and New Zealand. So one of the really interesting things growing up on an island was just how maritime it was, how connected it was, and the sense that though we were remote in British terms, we were really not remote in global terms, that there was this community. And I now lecture in the University of St Andrews on the east coast of Scotland. I live in Edinburgh, having had a bit of a meandering path through Dublin and Belfast and Barcelona and Glasgow and various other places to get here. Um, and I'm lucky enough to have been named in December as Scotland's Makar, the national poet, the fifth person to have this role in the new incarnation. The previous incarnation was back in the 16th century, so there was a little bit of a gap to 2001 when it was reinstigated. And I can't really quite believe it, to be honest. It's a fantastic honor, it's a fantastic responsibility as well, but it does mean I get to talk about poetry on an almost daily basis without having to apologize for it, which is at least something good for me.
So, the office of Makar, the name may be very old, but it's a fairly new position in Scotland. Can you tell us a bit about the office itself and its work?
So, and as I said, I'm the fifth. The poets before me were Edwin Morgan, Liz Lockhead, Jackie Kay, and Kathleen Jamie. Four fantastic poets who wrote in English and Scots and invented languages. They were playwrights. If you don't know Edwin Morgan's Loch Ness Monster song, go and look at that. It's in the voice of the Loch Ness Monster. It's fantastic. The basic role of the Macker is to write 3 to 4 poems a year in consultation with the Scottish government. They'll suggest topics that I write upon, but with no limit about what I should write. Um, and then beyond that, to celebrate and encourage poetry wherever I can and literature across Scotland. And so it's quite an open remit. Previous Mackers have been very interested in climate change and in the environmental crisis, so with a focus on nature poetry. Others were more interested, especially at the time of the pandemic, bringing people together in online fora in any way that was possible, and Jackie Kay was very good at that. One of the reasons that I was appointed is because I am the first Gaelic speaking Makar, and this would be, it's important that the three traditional languages of Scotland, well, if you ignore French and Latin, there are lots of traditional languages of Scotland, but three of the traditional languages of Scotland at least are reflected in the post and the people who can speak it. And it's quite an exciting time. There is a languages bill going through the Parliament in Scotland, which will give greater support to both Gaelic and the Scots language. And so there will be quite a lot of events associated with that and discussion associated with that in the coming months.
Hmm. So, how were you approached initially about the position? Was it a surprise to you?
It was a surprise to me. I was actually on the panel choosing the previous Macker, Kathy and Jamie, so I knew how the internal processes worked. But I was phoned up out of the blue by the chair of the panel and said, "You have been shortlisted. Would you be likely to accept it if it was offered to you? And if you would be likely to accept it, could you send a brief CV and a selection of poems on that will then be discussed and compared?" And then after about 5 weeks, I was given another phone call which said, if you were going to be officially offered this by the First Minister, would you accept it? Because I think it would be quite embarrassing if the First Minister invited somebody into the office and they said no. So they were just wanting to make sure everything was, all of the I's were dotted and the T's crossed. But as the panel said, it sits somewhere between being an honor, a responsibility, and a job. So it's not really sure quite what the role is. It's a mix of all of those things together.
It's only been, is it 2 months now since you first took
2nd of December, so time is flying.
the job? What types of things have you been asked to do to date?
So yesterday, I was at a Gaelic speaking primary school in Edinburgh doing the assembly. I've been asked to do more interviews than I can ever imagine having done in my life. I'm really sick of the sound of my own voice, so I'll try and keep this as short as possible. Um, I've been asked to do burn suppers, many burn suppers. I've been asked to take part in festivals, the possibility of doing a documentary about my life. But then, really interesting things. So I've been asked to do two different poems about orchards or about fruit blossom. And so I might have to do one about the cherry blossom season in Edinburgh and about an orchard um, in Stirling. And I've also been asked to write a poem that will go as the forward to the National Islands Plan, a government document later this year, which has to try and make sense of Scotland's hundreds of islands in a short 8-line poem, which is going to be an interesting task.
This is a hard question, I think, but because you've just started with this role, as you look forward over the next, several years of being Makar, what do you hope to accomplish? What would you have as your personal goals for this role?
One of the things I said I wanted to do, and it still holds, is that I want to bring as many people together speaking as many different languages through poetry in the next couple of years in Scotland. So I'm really interested in translation between Gaelic and English and Scots, but also all of the other languages that are spoken in Scotland. So to have a Polish poet and a Gaelic poet working together. So it's not just about me, but it's trying to bring other people in to have conversations to find commonality and difference across languages. And one of the things I've been asked to do is within St. Anne's University, where I work, is an already established project working with refugees in Scotland and sitting them down with poets and trying to get them, help them to tell their stories or to formulate them in different ways. And next year, Scotland also hosts the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow. So there is a possibility, at least, that the many languages represented by the Commonwealth. And politically, I do have some questions about the royal family and about the Commonwealth as an entity and about all of the whole history of that myself. But at its very best, it could be a forum for lots of multilingual play.
It's the multilingual aspect of the role and of poetry in Scotland is really a fascinating one. And, coming into the discussion today, I was thinking of all the interaction between Scottish Gaelic, Scots, English language, literature, poetry. But, as you mentioned, it's much more than that. There are other languages being spoken in Scotland today, being used. Uh, there are international connections. And, you've got an interesting perspective in that, having been in Barcelona, having been in Dublin. Um, I think some of your academic work has been on Seamus Heaney, if I'm correct. hmm You know, uh, could you talk a bit more about how the international world of poetry, uh, as it is evolving, affects Scotland today and affects you and what you are doing today?
So perhaps of interest, the book I did on Seamus Heaney was actually published by McGill Queen's University Press. It was them who were interested in it, so I'm really pleased to be published by a Canadian press. Um, I'm really lucky. I grew up in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland in the 1980s and 1990s, which was about the height of the UK's involvement in the European Union, and especially the UK's support for lesser used or minority languages within Europe as part of those schemes. So I was sent as a young school child to Brittany a couple of times, to Normandy, to Holland, to Belgium. I had pen friends in France, and there was this sense of the value of as many different languages as possible and having these conversations. So it was something I was raised with. I don't think the same opportunities are there now because of Brexit and because of the directions that the UK has taken. But because of that, I grew up bilingual, so I had Gaelic and English from my earliest memories and beyond my earliest memories. So I think that gave me a slight advantage with languages as well. I haven't found it as difficult as some other people to learn languages, or I haven't found the same psychological impediments. I don't mind appearing an idiot in languages because I know that at some point I might not be an idiot, or I don't mind creating a new personality in languages as you go, part of the game that you have to do. And because I'm also really interested in translating from one language to another, from Occitan using Catalan and French dictionaries into Gaelic without there being an English poem in between, say. So these kind of different bridge buildings between language communities or between countries, it's something I was taught to do from a very young age. And it's just a great form of play. It's a great form of being in the world to be able to choose the connections that you can make yourself between languages.
You hit on something really interesting, I think, in talking about bridge building between language communities. And we can talk about that within Scotland and out with Scotland too. But also, in part, is that the importance of poetry to Scotland today or to us today in general? I mean, I had a multi-layered question in mind of, why is poetry important? Why is it important to Scotland? And why specifically to Gaelic? But I think we can talk about bridge building perhaps in that sense.
We can do. Poetry's really odd. Poetry's a very private art form. It's something that you tend to write by yourself. And on the one hand, it's this deeply internal creation that you then pass on to somebody else that they can memorize and take, and it becomes their internalized creation. So, how many people here could quote the Red Wheelbarrow or could quote the Road Not Taken as something that they just have within them. And it's really interesting the way that poetry can then be used to form your own psyche, form your own language. And so, on an individual level, yeah, it's very much a bridge making between a poet and a listener or a reader, and then they can do whatever they want with it. Um, I think within Scotland, well, poetry has always been crucial for Gaelic because it was for centuries the literary form. Up until about the 1900s, everything was done in poetry, and all of that poetry could be sung. And so the line between poetry and song only was broken in about the 1910s. But this meant that poetry had this really quite unusual in the context of the UK role as the way of giving political comment, of giving religious truth, the way of engaging with the news and events of the day. And so if you look at even the early publications that were done in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there's an excess of poetry in there. There's so much poetry in there alongside different types of publication that you wouldn't have got in the English speaking world at the same time. So many proverbs, so many jokes. And it's a way of keeping a culture alive, but also of sharing knowledge in a different way. I think that's still there, or there's a heightened awareness of that in the Gaelic world alongside such things as the new detective drama that went out early last week in Chilean. And so it's maintaining the connection between the hyper modern world of media and the traditional role of poetry. It's a challenge, but it's fun.
Mhm. You know, in you know, do you think that poetry is important to the survival and growth of the language of Gaelic moving forward?
In one specific limited way, yes. Um, what poetry does is it tests and pushes at the limits of language. It makes you do something new with language. It makes you see what the language can do anew, or it actually makes you think, okay, this is this is there's a subject that needs written about that's not been written about before, but let's do it in a way that actually extends the language itself. And this is what poetry does. Poetry is always working at those limits. Otherwise, it becomes cliched and hackneyed. And I don't know if any of you work for Hallmark, but I'm not a huge fan of Hallmark cards, say, because of that hackneyed quality. And I think poetry and that kind of exercise is crucial for the life of any language. Otherwise, the language becomes preserved in aspect. It is a language that doesn't change. It's a language that doesn't have any future, but just is obsessed with the past. And I think that would be a disaster for Gaelic, as would be for any language. Of course, you could say the same things about comedy, as I just said about poetry there.
That's true. That's true. I wanted to just break and see if anyone in the audience has a question they want to ask, so I'm not hogging the stage with you. If anyone wants to raise their hand, okay. Well, I wanted to go into your own work for a bit and your own approach to poetry. Uh,
Liam, there's two questions. Well, Thomas
oh,
had his hand up, and Trish
oh,
has.
okay. Well, we'll go to we have. I'm not seeing that unfortunately, but
Thomas has just taken his hand down as well, so I'm sorry if I've put you on the spot, Thomas.
is there somebody else who had
Uh,
their hand?
I can submit. It's
Go ahead.
almost a trivial question, but it traces my interest. One of um, the largest internationalizing forces in language, of course, is languages of science. And it is also one of the most expansive sources of language, or has been for the last couple of centuries. Um, and I'm very interested in that, although I'm very interested in poetry, Gaelic poetry in particular, but others as well. What interaction can you see that would support the growth of language between these streams?
Between the streams of poetry and science,
And the language of science.
the language of science. Um, I think the language of science is so incredibly rich, partly because it is so rooted still in Greek and Latin. And so even in English, anytime that you're using scientific vocabulary, you're having to do a kind of imaginative leap because quite often you're having to translate yourself into this other world of ologies and the bios and the anthropes. And it is certainly for English, the language of science has been this wonderfully broadening world. I think I've got no fear whatsoever about that for Gaelic because one of the wonderful things is being able to draw from as many languages as possible. I think the innovations of science sometimes become a bit convoluted in languages that have different linguistic or semantic structures to Greek or Latin. And so I was teaching to a primary school teacher yesterday about the difficulty of teaching chemistry in Gaelic and having to use the different forms in Gaelic and whether this was a realistic or legitimate thing to be doing. There's a fantastic poet called Miroslav Holub, who was a Polish poet, I think it was, who was also a chemist as well, who's written very, very well about the metaphoric potential of linguistic poetry as well, of scientific language as well, and how you can pull that across. I'm not sure if that answered your question at all because I was having to think on the spot.
As I was thinking on the spot, and I thank you very much for your observations. They are, I I think that they're correct, but I enjoyed the expression. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see Dustin has his hand up.
Yes. Thank you for that, or thank you for the explanation. One thing I was thinking of too was, I know in the past that they've had something called a Bulletin Affiliate, where basically it was not uncommon to see various poets taking Greek and Latin terms and using it for various purposes. At least at the time, it was more or less used to obscure their meaning. But in this case, I could see this as a possibility of um, creating intersections between the language of science and Gallic. And I'm curious to see what you have if you have any thoughts on that.
I think, especially in English, say, there was often a trend towards using Latinate forms to give a higher status to your work and to your ideas, to have be the more elevated form of poetry. And so one of the interesting things always to me is the difference or the tension between a vernacular poetry and a poetry of knowledge. So that would be a poetry that uses everyday speech and a poetry that uses the language of science or of the Bible or of any form of reified communication. And I think if you can get a poem that does both of those, great. If you have a poem that can use the language of everyday communication, of slang, of swearing, and then you put that alongside the more reified, whether that be because it's been drawn from different languages or because it's been drawn from a reified context, then all of a sudden something really interesting is happening. And I'm really interested in swearing, and this is entirely is a tangent. But one of the ways you do that is by using the lowest forms of language alongside the highest forms of language, and that could be also with the languages of science or with the adaptations from the classical languages. Trish has asked, "What is my favorite Gaelic poem I have ever written?" Usually the last one, to be honest, the last one that's worked, because you always have to keep going. Dustin, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We had a question too from Goody about what are the challenges of keeping Gaelic current with the changing times and how can poetry help there?
So I worked for the BBC for about 3, 4 years as a news journalist and as a news producer working on BBC in law and working to the radio programs Radio na Gael and Irish Matnia. And this comes up every single day because every single day there will be a story there that requires phrasing or thinking about in Gaelic that perhaps has never been done before. Whether it is to do with different types of technology, different places in the world, or different religions. And so Gaelic has to, if it is going to be a full and adequate means of communication, and I think it has to be able to address any topic. But this does mean that you have to innovate and think on your feet. And so it was really interesting, say, working at the BBC, you would see 3 or 4 different variations of a phrase develop over the course of a day. And you can still do that if you listen to the radio at 7:30 in the morning our time. By 8 o'clock at night, there will be an evolution of language happening in front of your eye, depending on dialectical variations or depending on just who's working that day.
Mhm.
But I think poetry definitely has a role to play in this because poetry is one of those forums as well where without the day-to-day requirement to come up with a language on the spot, you can perhaps be a bit more thoughtful about it, or you can perhaps spend more time looking in the dictionaries or in the older texts to see if there was a suitable phrase there that you could maybe draw across.
Mhm.
Many of the BBC journalists do that anyway because they are very, very, very good and very literate.
We had a brief question from Erin asking how familiar you are with Canadian Gaelic poetry. I'm assuming poetry written not just in Nova Scotia, but across Canada. Want to
I
clarify that, Erin, or?
I'm in Nova Scotia.
And so say I edited a book with Ian S. McPherson from Canada. I did an anthology called the New and so I've had quite a lot of conversations, though Ian's not from Nova Scotia, about the different history and the different poets working in Canada today, as I have with Rob Dunbar, who's one of the professors here in Edinburgh, and is a good friend. I've read quite a lot, but I'm far from being an expert. And in some ways, um, this is one of the positions where I would feel like a colonial upstart if I was going to say too much about it in the inverse position, because I think um, having a Scottish perspective on Canadian Gaelic poetry is always going to be limited, is always going to be decentralizing, because I'm always going to think, well, Scotland is the center of culture, and it isn't. But I would find it very hard to overcome my own limitations. I've never been to Nova Scotia, say I've never been to any of the Gaelic speaking areas of Canada, and so I've only ever read them in books.
Mhm. Well, hopefully in your role as Makar, you'll be able to travel as well, and who knows where you'll be able to go. So that's
I,
something that would be fantastic. Uh, I wanted to ask a bit about how you personally approach poetry. How you initially were drawn to it. You know, when you talked about growing up in the maritime environment, that closely connected environment in Lewis, um, was poetry something that surrounded you, that you were drawn to at that time, or did this develop later in your life?
so because I grew up in Lewis, literature was not a distant or alien thing, and I'm really lucky because of that. The next village down, there was a great short story writer, Ian Murray, who was Ian John Murray in Morroch, who was a friend of my father's. Three villages up, you had Ulster of Oxford and Trameth of Oxford, a great writing family up in Ness. And you were aware of them. So there was always the possibility of going, well, if they can write, you can too. It's not something that you can't think about, you can't aspire to do. Murcha Vox, Murcha Mikilavora, my great great uncle was quite a well-known poet in Lewis as well before he emigrated to Niagara Falls. So there was that in the family too, and with singers and song collectors on my mother's side. So it was always there. Um, and my mother claims to have a poem that I wrote when I was 3 or 4 years old, though I, I'm let's not call it poetry. It was words on a piece of paper. Um, But I think, where does poetry come from? Sorley MacLean said that he would not be a Gael without a sense that the auditory was the main emphasis or the main element of poetry. So for him, it started with sound, and almost always with sound, with a cadence, with a rhythm, with a particular word and the sound of that word. And that's partly true with me. Sometimes it is just clusters of words or clusters of sound coming together, and then a poem comes from that, rather than necessarily a big topic or a big idea. It might be with a physical object or a language itself that it develops out of, and then the sound takes over, the rhythm takes over.
No, and
Thomas has a question again, I think.
Inspired by your last few sentences, um, what are the prospects of developing, and there is some, but a rich visual poetry divorced from this auditory tradition that you cite?
Um,
This is I must admit, this is probably Ezra Pound imagist thinking that's coming through here.
well, I've given classes on concrete poetry before, and
I mean, like
I
George Campbell Hay Bezerta or something that is very visual, and um, there is some auditory components, but it is possible to write, simply a construction of the image, and for that, uh, I saw eternity the other night like a pure ring of endless light.
I think absolutely, and so there is the whole spectrum there. I've taught classes on concrete poetry before, where the whole point and purpose is visual. It is an image and using the letters to create that image, with the auditory perhaps almost secondary. Um, I I think I used pounds in a station at the metro in about five
Yes.
essays that I wrote at university because it was so easy to remember, and you could talk
Yes.
about it in almost any context whatsoever. Um, and I think one of the roles, and to be honest, one of the great things that we need in Gaelic poetry is a bit more imagism, a bit more very specific and evocative depictions of the world that Gaelic exists in, whatever that may be. And so just without necessarily following the song rhythms and the song patterns or turning it into a full soundscape. Um, when I started out writing, one of the things that I tried to do was precisely to break the idea of poetry as song and having this overall melody. I like things to be disruptive and unharmonious so that the images would come through. I think the longer I've gone on, my poetic lines have got longer, my rhythm has become much more important, and the image itself gets a
Mhm.
little bit lost. That's a useful reminder.
Okay.
Are there any specific topics that you're drawn to? How does a poem originate in you?
I tend to write poetry about 15 years after the fact, so I'm really looking forward to poems about 2010, 2011. Um, and I've got themes that would appear far too often. Sea, birds, traveling, relationship between languages, the sounds between languages. And so, left to my own devices, I'd probably end up writing the same poem again and again and again. So it's really quite useful. I've been asked to write lots of poems in the last 5 years. I've had lots of different commissions, and that's in some ways actually been really useful for me to make me think differently.
Okay. I think this would be a good time to talk more about your own work or to share some of your own work, if you'd like to do that.
Happily, and then I'd love to hear poems from what other people are here so that I don't have to listen to myself all evening. But the questions have been great. I'm going to read um two poems, if that's okay, because I think Liam asked me to read two. One of them is actually um partly in response to Thomas's question. It's a prose poem, so it's a block of prose rather than lineated, so it has a slightly different pattern. And one of the things that we're really lucky in the islands of Scotland, especially, is that we have a very, very long visual history. People have been sending photographers, camera people, and recorders to the islands for decades. And so it is possible to see or to hear recordings of grandparents quite often in a way that's not necessarily that common in other places. And so that's partly related to this. This is called Pripich Nasula, and I'll read it in the Gaelic and then the English. Ha mé céad film ar TV, Muintir theatr verrug is gausan, Cúch ac y cardach raim an dóir chorachan, tíon crain cólan an talverrug gus filmecin, a chai a Janus an skire sna siatan. Sydyn da cwt siw I thein ecyn awn cach an parantan, agus an siender an gus sinnaverin, na guhan agus glwys nac a chyfôr ar chawlach anis, suas an sin screen mór y projector. Nes metal chiche agus nes lui na hafa cain ac ore. Har an channel sin a vís sealtain gain seamtain gain hain ar achrélik. Se seán cerf tripa chunig mé agus ha mé a fehu a sean an jerich. Der ham film disel agus iad a jana aclavan le kuch agus iad an ddói. Nyr chai na chai aslach a ríist. Cwg gnóich ham a bhathar a cur falaf na sérichan. Punctum. I am watching a film on TV. People from Shadler, Borv, and Golson. Many of them my relatives, one way or another. They've been gathered together in the hall to watch an old film from the 60s that was shot in the area. Some of them can see themselves on it, others their parents and grandparents, whose movement and voices they struggle to remember, but are there now on the big projection screen, the voices with a metallic quality, the movement slightly more hurried than in real life. This is on the channel that gives us versions of ourselves, repeated over and over. This is the fourth time I have seen it, and I am waiting for the end, where the film is finished and people are being interviewed, elated about the memory that has been reopened. In the background, my mother is tidying away the chairs. And the second one I'm going to read, the other one. I was commissioned to write 3 poems about different places in Edinburgh, places of my choosing. And one of the places was St. Columba's Church, just near the castle in Edinburgh, if you know it, which is built on the location of what was the first Gaelic church there, though it has moved. And the Gaelic graveyard that was there, the graveyard of the Gaelic church, has also been moved, so we've no idea where any of the bones are. Duncan Ban McIntyre is buried in Edinburgh, but not where that statue is. We have no idea where the bones are. The poem's not about this at all. I just used this to have the opportunity to write about St. Columba, Columcille, because he is a really interesting figure. So this is Columcille, and it uses lots of material I took from a book by Mary Beath, an expert on medicine in the Highlands and Islands. Yr an sciol fa lucht y Columcille yn dylu leish, sin agus imicin. Le bhí glós dat níl súl a ard nó lúsa chur achtas buachile. Íontach an neolalas vic na manich agus am neanamie. Bar clach gan a hocal gus tí chaine lical na scéil, curach a chur an aracha gniúl gan húl glas a chilich. I dhí sin na fírin, se seirse de grama han an léis go tríc. Lesoch agus titcher cuach. Misneach an nurga cantin shawl agus bí cútecan, átecan a seoltain. Drama agus titcher cúteach nachil uran an dóiánach tchichich, gachrut a gimmerse jawl or chi javara. Shaulore, a jana kles agus magéche leish, a shesu an seilseach gebéad dé ar dúlar, a lican ricúant nure, a kainachich, lentinore. The story goes that Columba had the skill of curing blindness, that and nerves, by couching a cataract or placing St. John's wort in a shepherd's boy's armpit. Amazing the knowledge the monks had, and the metal, drilling through skulls to remove forgetfulness, putting a currach to sea with no destination, not turning a grey eye back. Their healing was often a kind of theatre. Acting, sleight of hand, the power of suggestion, the confidence that you can say, see, and someone somewhere will look. Theatre and the knowledge too that sometimes there's no choice but to risk all you have on the tide. Look, they are playing again, they are flitting, stepping into the spotlights of all kinds of stages, setting out to sea, unforgetting.
Well, Tapa Glaive Gumor for the poems and for the translations. Uh, there were one or two more questions that I had before we would go to our next part of the program. And that is, Valeria had a question about whether you have any suggestions outside of the usual for deepening one's appreciation for, and as she says, internalization of Gaelic poetry.
I'd have to know what the usual are. So Seamus Heaney, who I did a PhD on, when he was working as a teacher trainer, which was a job he did in the 1970s, he encouraged his trainee teachers to memorize a poem a day, which is a challenge for the best of us, I would say. But it was a poem a day so that you built up the store and this knowledge of the vocabulary within you. The people who, and I'm a terrible singer, an awful singer, but if you do that for with songs as well, or songs for them any mod, you just build up the storehouse of how the language works, the different structure and syntax and phrases, and the different ways that you can put images and ideas together that you can draw upon. There are loads of great anthologies out there, very good historical ones. There aren't that many contemporary anthologies, so any individual books that you can keep a lookout for. Um, and things like the website of the Scottish Poetry Library has lots of contemporary poems that you can look at and see.
I was going to mention the website because you also are on there, of course, and some of your work is on there too. That's scottishpoetrylibrary.org.uk. So that's a great resource for people. Now, excuse me a moment as I move from one form here to another. I guess a closing question might be, as there are several people with us today who I know also write poetry, what advice, what chorea would you have for those who are writing poetry in Gaelic or who are interested in writing poetry?
Um, write, don't be scared. Write as much as you can, write non-stop. But read. Every writer is a reader first and foremost, I think. Yeah, you have to read and read and read to actually have the vocabulary, to have the ideas, to um, be able to place yourself in kinds of conversations with other writers as well. And so, if in doubt, if you've got nothing to say, translate. Or if you've got nothing to say, take somebody's short story and turn it into a poem, and write a poem after, and see what you can do to change between medium. And so, I think it's great to see as much writing in Gaelic as possible. And there's no limits to what you can do. Any kind of media that you like, any kind of story, any kind of idea, any kind of object that you know hasn't been written about in Gaelic before, give it a go.